Well, hello, everyone. My name is Gary Machan, and I'd like to welcome you to our event tonight to stop the Bradford Bypass. I am the project lead for the Community Health Climate Action Initiative, which consists of community health centers across Ontario. As well as a proud member of Just Recovery Simcoe. And both of our organizations share a strong commitment to advancing healthy, just, resilient, sustainable communities, as well as are deeply concerned about the climate change. And what we also know is that in order to build healthier communities, what's really important is to have wise investments in people, in our environment, in our communities. And when we learned about the Bradford Bypass, it was really our deep concern about how these expenditures would really almost be the antithesis of what we believe to be a just recovery. And so the purpose of this particular event is to draw attention to this, but as is stated in the title of the webinar, it is to take action. And we believe that that we are at a critical juncture, and as you'll hear from our speakers, there's a lot that we can do in order to bring this development to a halt. Before I get into the agenda, however, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. It seems rather apropos given the nature of this particular work. And it reads, today we are gathering in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. We would like to honor the First Nations communities in the area, including the Chippewa Tri-Council and Williams Treaty First Nations, and wish to acknowledge that their ancestors were first stewards of these lands. These are lands that were meant to be shared with nature and in a way that honors the life that we have been given. The history of this land clearly demonstrates that we have not lived up to this intention or promise. To have hope for future generations, to have a sustainable world for them, we must recognize the value in each other, reconcile for past tragedies, and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. Further, we must recognize that the various components of our ecosystem, air, land, water, flora, and fauna are all interdependent and need to work in harmony. The only way forward is together. And so on that note, what I would like to do is move into the agenda for this evening. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to be asking a few questions to each of our guests, Gord Miller and Laura Bowman, after which we will be passing it over to Margaret Prophet, who will be directing us in terms of the actions to take. And afterwards, we're going to have a question and answer period. So we certainly welcome you to submit your questions, comments in the chat. And if there's someone in particular that you would like to have the question directed to, please let us know that as well. Claire will be helping me in that part. So in any event, what I'd like to do is start with our first question. Gord Miller, in many ways, doesn't need a whole lot of introductions, given his past and strong credentials, having served for 3 consecutive 5-year terms as our Environment Commissioner. And so my question to you, Gord, is based on your extensive experience as Environmental Commissioner, now as Chair as Earth Roots. What does the construction of the Bradford Bypass in one of Ontario's most important wetlands signify to you?
Well, I think it signifies. I mean, clearly there's going to be impacts, damage. There are costs. There are real costs. There are costs of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. There are costs and to the species at risk, some of which are truly endangered. There are costs in the loss of agricultural land, irreplaceable agricultural land in the case of the Holland Marsh portions. There's costs in all sorts of natural heritage lands as we go through, but the government has chosen to exempt this process from the environmental assessment process of the province. And what does that mean? It means we're not asking the fundamental questions. Why are we doing this? What is the need? Why are we contributing billions of dollars in this loss of natural heritage and natural and future agricultural land, and why are we threatening Lake Simcoe and the watershed of the Holland River as it goes through? To what end? What is the purpose? What is the need that we're servicing, and what are the alternatives to that need? And it's this abandonment of the well thought out environmental assessment process that existed in Ontario for almost 50 years. What was respected around the world, by the way, when we made it in the 1970s. That is the huge shock here. We're going in blind. We're just building a thing because we seem to be in building things mode without any consideration of the need for that and alternatives to that, so that we don't have to pay this big price. And that's why we've been talking about asking the federal government to step in. If the province won't do an environmental assessment, then let's get the feds to come in.
Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. And my next question is for Laura Bowman. For those of you who don't know Laura, she's a senior lawyer with Ecojustice Canada, their Toronto's office, and has been invaluable in terms of providing legal advice on this particular issue, as well as several others. And my question to you, Laura, is there are a lot of details that are from the original studies that are not being told to the public about the impacts of this highway to our community's environment. And so I'm wondering what do you think are the most important impacts that we should know that aren't being addressed by the province?
Well, I think a big one is climate. The original environmental assessment never did an assessment of climate impacts. And we know that the Ministry of Transportation has a history of not acknowledging phenomena like induced demand, which means that more vehicle kilometers are traveled when you add additional road capacity, which increases greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one of the big potential impacts. We know that there's a proportional relationship between adding road space, particularly for highways, and people driving more. And Ontario's transportation emissions are currently ballooning out of control and a very serious issue for meeting our Paris Agreement targets nationally. The other big one is water contamination. The original EA predicted severe stormwater and groundwater contamination. Things like chloride and phosphorus are a huge concern for Lake Simcoe. We know that this project is likely to cause increases to those contaminants, which will impact the fishery in Lake Simcoe, will impact the quality of the habitat in Holland Marsh, and potentially adversely impact agricultural operations in the Holland Marsh as well, because there's a shallow groundwater system there. So the impacts of the contamination can be quite severe. And then there's things like the public health impacts, impaired air quality in the vicinity of the highway. There's very severe effects from other 400 series highways that have been studied. Things like benzene, nitrogen oxides are very elevated in the vicinity of highways, and the Bradford Bypass would go adjacent to built up areas of Bradford, soon to be built up areas of Queensville and River Drive Park in East Gwillimbury. And there's no plan to do any kind of health impact analysis that would gauge what the true health impacts would actually be for people living there, and we can expect them to be very severe things. One of the things that has come to light as a result of COVID, when people stopped driving in the original March 2020 lockdown, preterm births fell dramatically around the world. And that event has caused scientists to confirm the link between elevated preterm births and traffic-related air pollution. We also know that traffic-related air pollution is associated with things like dementia and the malformation of children's lungs. So the very serious health effects, not just things that we would typically associate like asthma, but a wide range of cognitive and developmental impairments that can have, certainly at the population level, be very serious issues. So that's another thing that is a big concern. And then of course there's the direct loss of habitat and the impacts to the habitat corridor around the Holland Marsh wetland, which is a very significant wetland.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura, and certainly some really serious impacts that you don't tend to hear about, which really again begs the question of, why are we proceeding with this, especially when the majority of people in this region don't want the bypass. Over to you, Gord. Obviously, someone with your background would be well aware of the challenges that climate change is posing and will pose on our communities. But how do you feel about the Ford's government building more highways in Southern Ontario, as obviously this is one of many projects in the wings, and especially in the midst of what clearly is not just a climate crisis, but abrupt climate change right now?
Back to the question we had before, like, well, it's not, we know that they're building, or they want to build all these highways. Why?
Yeah.
What's the need? What are we servicing? What is the purpose of building all these highways? Why are they trying to increase? Where's the traffic coming from? What's going on? Is this really about highways? Is it really about commuting? Or is it really about opening up land for residential development to the benefit of specific landowners who have millions and millions of dollars invested? Is this about, we're making this sacrifice of natural heritage and ecosystem integrity and billions of dollars of taxpayers' money in order to make some land developers wealthy? Is that what we're doing here? I mean, I think that's the question. You see, it's easy to focus on, oh, you're going to build a highway, but that's going to damage this, that's going to cause this problem. Yes, it does. Yes, it will. But why are we doing it? And is there an alternative to it? What about expanding the GO system? If they're trying to move people north-south, what about dual tracking? What about expanding the GO system? There are other alternatives than rather just cars. Look at all what about the 407? What about removing the tariffs on the 407? If we want to move people east-west between the 400 and the 404, the 407 is already there, but people aren't using it to full capacity because it's too damned expensive. There's an alternative. And if we are building this things, or all these highways, just to expand, to produce residential lots to the benefit of a narrow scope of land developers who have secured the land, why on earth aren't there levies put on those lots to pay for that damned highway and to pay for perhaps some mitigation to the natural heritage losses that are going on? Maybe securing some more public lands, maybe securing some of the wetlands in protected status as parks or conservation reserves. Why not levy the lots? Why should they benefit from our huge investment of natural heritage and a huge investment of taxpayers' money to create roads to make them billionaires? I don't understand the logic there. Ask the question, why are we doing it? Is there an alternative? Is there a better way? And that's what environmental assessment is supposed to do.
Yeah, to which I think, we all say here, a lot sounds like the Jerry Maguire movie, show me the money and I'll follow the money, and that'll explain who this is really benefiting. And quite clearly it isn't for the benefit of the people here, but as you've indicated, for a pretty small and select group. I'd like to go back to you now, Laura, with this question. And that is, can you explain in layman terms the exemptions that have been given for this highway that demonstrate public benefit isn't a key consideration? And can you also explain why getting a designation for federal impact is important for the Bradford Bypass?
So I'll kind of circle back to some of the things Gord was talking about. The purpose of environmental assessment needs to be understood. It's not just to do general research about the potential impacts of a project. It's to help the government decide whether or not a project is in the public interest, whether or not it meets an identified need, whether or not it does it in the most environmentally responsible and cost-effective and socially beneficial way. So when we talk about not doing an environmental assessment, we're not just talking about not doing the studies. We're talking about not making the key decision that is the environmental assessment decision. Should this be done, or should something else be done, or should nothing be done, right? And so one of the deep flaws in the original environmental assessment was it didn't consider need. There was a lack of analysis of the traffic issues, and some of that analysis is even, when we talk about this being, 25 years old, some of that analysis that was done, to look at the traffic issues at all, to the extent they were minimally looked at, some of it's from the 1980s. Okay, so it's that out of date. We have completely different issues now. They've never been addressed in terms of identifying what the need is and how best to meet that need. The exemption allows the government to not comply with the conditions of approval, which required further study of some of the issues I mentioned earlier, things like groundwater contamination, archaeological heritage issues, stormwater contamination, noise, things that they didn't address properly in the first EA were supposed to be addressed. And as part of that condition, the Ministry of Environment had to approve those studies and had to approve the mitigation from those studies. That is now gone. There's no more decision about whether or not this goes ahead. There's no more decision about whether or not we need it, whether or not it's in the public interest, whether or not the mitigation is good enough. That's all gone because of the exemption. You'll hear a lot of talk from the ministry about how, well, they're still studying various issues. Yes, they might at some point disclose the impacts of, on things like groundwater. But those studies no longer inform any decision about whether or not to do this project or how to do this project. It's entirely up to the Ministry of Transportation now. The Ministry of Environment has no further role. And so, the studies could find that the air pollution is so bad that people will drop dead. It doesn't change anything. The project still would be built. It's still exempt from environmental assessment. And that, so that is the issue. The exemption takes away the decision about whether or not this goes ahead. The exemption prevents the studies, if they are ever completed, and we still haven't seen those studies, to be clear. They say they're doing X, Y, and Z studies. Many of those studies will be completed after the construction is commenced under the exemption. So they will commence the bridge at Yonge Street near Bradford, the overpass next to people's houses. They'll build that first and then they'll do the studies. When will we ever see what the impacts will actually are? We don't know. So it's really closing the barn door after the horse is out, to tell everyone what the terrible impacts will be after you've started construction already. And you, once you start construction, for example, you can't do things like change the route alignment or change the mitigation in a major way, right? You can't shift to a different, better alternative once you've started construction. So it precludes even, a good faith change of mind once the studies actually reveal the true impacts.
So it's pretty much a cynical ploy from what, the way you're making it sound. I mean, the highway gets built anyways. As you've indicated, why bother with these exemptions? But
if I can just interject, Gary, it's more than a cynical ploy. It's a violation of international standards. It's widely recognized that when you're doing an assessment of an initiative, you don't start until you've decided, you at least measured all the impacts to the best of your ability, so that you can make a rational decision. And so it's a violation, and this is not just Ontario, or it's not just Canada. This is widely recognized internationally that this is how you go about things. And they're clearly violating that, throwing it in the face of people all around the world.
Yeah, definitely hear you. But as we are gathering, the whole intent of this is to take action. And unfortunately, there is another level of government, that is the federal government, and in particular, the environmental minister, Stephen Guilbeault. And so what I'd like to do now is pass it over to Margaret Prophet, who is the executive director for the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition, is provided tremendous leadership in this campaign, along with several other organizations and people. And so Margaret, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Gary. Okay, so here's the down and dirty, if you will, folks. The Ford government wants to start construction on this bypass within a few months if nothing changes. Bridges built, the bridge built, people expropriated from their homes. You've just heard from our expert, wonderful panelists who will return to shortly about how this isn't getting the proper study. The last chance for us before an election, and hopefully, if things change politically, that's a different story, but assuming nothing else changes, the last chance for us to get a proper study and put a halt to this is the federal government to do what it says it wants to do, which is stand up for climate. So I'm going to share my screen, and some of you may have been involved in a phones app before, some of you haven't. It's basically, we're just going to stop for like 5-10 minutes. And as I'm going through this, some of you fast readers and eager beavers can go through this slide and see that we've given you the contact information for Stephen Guilbeault's office. We've given you the contact information for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, their Ontario office. And below there is a little bit of an example of what you can say. I will tell you that speaking to many people that work in government, when they get a phone call, they figure that there's at least 50 to 100 more people that are concerned about that issue, because phone calls is one more level of involvement, just below kind of going to your MPP or MP's office. So if you can, take a minute to call one of the numbers. We're trying to go with Stephen Guilbeault first. You might get a busy signal. That's okay. Try this number instead. And, say what your name is, where you're from. Make sure you say, I want the Bradford Bypass designated for a federal impact assessment, and then add whatever reasons. What are the things that are bothering you about this bypass that you want done? And then it would be great if in the chat, if you sent an email tonight, if you made a phone call, let us know how many emails, how many phone calls did you make? Each one is going to count. I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to make my own phone calls. I think Gary might be able to do the same thing. If you have made your phone calls and you've done your emails, we'll be back in probably about 10 minutes, but we'll give everybody a chance. In the meantime, fill the chat with whether you got a busy signal, if we're good enough, we'll get it to the point where the voice mailbox is full. That's a good thing. So everybody, let's get calling, and please report in the chat about whether you made a phone call and a number so we can keep track. This is the time, this is what climate action looks like. So this is a good chance for us all to do something on the ground. Yeah, so just to make it clear, there's you'll get a voicemail because it's after hours. So I left my message with Stephen Guilbeault, and I am going to make my second phone call now to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Thank you to Melissa and to MJ, to Fabio. Try the next one if you didn't get through. Thank you, Kelsey. Voicemails at all three. Wonderful. I'm going to make my second phone call and I'll come back, and then we'll continue on here in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody. I just left my Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, being very respectful. Great to see so many people that were leaving messages. Thank you to Sarah, Tony, MJ, Fabio again, Helen, Wendy. Wonderful for all. So thank you, Beryl and Leslie. Ralph, this is great. And this is the kind of thing that makes a difference in a project like this. We know that they're going to be making a decision within the next week. So this is a really good opportunity for us to see what it takes for climate action. If that's the thing that's upsetting you, these are the kind of tasks, the calling, the pressuring, the making sure that your political representatives know what your opinion is. Thank you to Susan and to Wayne and to Wilma Murray, everybody. If you haven't got through, then please continue. But I will leave this up for a little bit longer. Oh, good. David just said that Guibo's mailbox was full. So yay, that's great, because my understanding is they can only handle about 50. So that's what I was told. So that's great. So if you can't get to Guibo, yes, we also made the IAC Ontario office mailbox full. I don't know what their maximum is for there, but that's great. That means the staff tomorrow are going to be getting up and checking their mailbox and go, oh my gosh, we have so many messages about the Bradford Bypass. That's amazing. Great. I'm so happy and just heartened that each of you have taken that that stand tonight with us. So you'll be getting an email from everybody that attended that has these numbers in there. So feel free, you can always call more than once. The more that they hear from us, the more that they know that we want it. So I will share my screen for just a little bit longer. If you haven't had a chance to call, or if you want to call tomorrow, I'll leave it up for another minute so that you can write those numbers down or emails, and then I will pass it back over to Gary, but I'll just leave this up for another minute.
Yeah, just
Take it away, Gary.
to support you on that message, I just think that we're at a really critical juncture, as Margaret indicated. And if there's one thing I've learned through a lot of the provincial campaigns that I've been involved with, it's that it's really about citizen power, and how we're a lot more powerful than we think we are. And our voices do matter. And as Margaret indicated, these are the kind of actions that make the difference. And so if you aren't able to get through, please get those numbers down. Try tomorrow, but also contact other people that you know that might be sympathetic to this cause. And we got to keep the pressure on, because I think that with Stephen Guilbeault, I think we might have someone who's supportive. But what we need to do, in the words of President Roosevelt, is turn the heat up. So I think that's really what this is about, is creating enough heat so the environment minister can do the right thing, and trust that he will do the right thing if we do our jobs as citizens in terms of letting our voices be heard.
Do you want me to go through any questions, or?
I was just going to offer to start asking questions right when
Great.
everybody comes into my room. Okay, so the first question is Joe Good's question, and I'd like to direct that to Gord, please. Question is, why isn't this project already designated under the Impact Assessment Act 2019? It is categorized as a physical activity under Section 50 of the Physical Activities Regulations. It states the construction, operation, decommissioning, and abandonment of a new permanent causeway with a continuous length of 400 meters or more through navigable water. Well, that's a very technical question. Do you think
Sure.
you can handle that, Gord? Thanks.
I think so. The key thing is to remember that, we have two levels of government in this country. You have federal, in our Constitution, there's federal responsibilities and there's provincial responsibilities. And the most of the factors here, this is clearly a provincial responsibility. It's a provincial highway. It's an initiative and an undertaking by the provincial government. So it should be covered by the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act, and then the damn government exempted themselves, right? So the question is, when does there is a federal Impact Assessment Act, and it has to hang on hooks of constitutional federal responsibility. And so all of a sudden now the big thing is not clearly something that they can assess. They have to look at things like fisheries and navigable waters and matters that come in the Constitution under federal jurisdiction. And even then they can say, and we have those here. We have migratory birds issues. We have First Nations issues. But the government the federal government secondarily goes in and has to make a decision. But the assumption is, first and foremost, this is the obligation and responsibility of the province. What's happened is they reneged. And so that's why, and so the feds still can go in, but normally they would not. Normally, unless there's some egregious thing happening in a federal jurisdiction, they would say, no, we'll defer to the province. And that's why this one's a weird one.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. The next two questions I'm going to direct to Laura. Hope that's okay. So Laura, what do you hope a federal EA will yield? It'll be a federal impact assessment. Will it just delay the construction of the highway, or will it honestly protect natural cultural heritage and species at risk? I'm for protecting natural heritage and wildlife and cultural heritage. Is there any other agency or means we should be seeking to protect the site and the watershed?
One of the reasons that we are interested in a federal EA for this project is, first of all, because there is no provincial EA being conducted for the project. In terms of what the impact of a federal EA would be if it is designated, the Federal Impact Assessment Act contains a prohibition on construction of any element of the project that requires a federal permit. So they would not be able to build over any water crossings, across rail lines. They would not be able to do anything for which they need a Species at Risk Act permit until they complete an EA. So one of the main benefits of the federal impact assessment is that it ensures that the impact assessment precedes a decision to go forward with the project, that the public become aware of what the actual impacts would be before construction starts. So that's the main benefit of the federal impact assessment. Now, most federal impact assessments are ultimately approved to go ahead, but they're often approved with hundreds of conditions for major projects, which is not the case in most provincial EAs. So another potential benefit of federal EA is that there are better conditions placed on the project. But there have been federal EAs that are not approved, unlike provincially in Ontario, where it's virtually guaranteed. There have been major projects where the impacts are considered too serious federally to be authorized ever. So that would be, obviously the ideal scenario for a project like this that really runs contrary to most of the modern policy objectives that we've already discussed around climate and health and other things. There's definitely a possibility of stopping the project through federal EA. There isn't really another agency that looks at the project as a whole. That's what EA is for, right? There's agencies that permit just the water crossings or just the stormwater ponds. But nobody actually asks the question, should this go ahead or not, except through the EA process. And that's why it's so fundamental.
Thanks, Laura. It's amazing to have you and the extensive knowledge you've got on the file here. So here's an interesting question. Maybe you answer this and then Gord answers it. How was the government able to create or push through the exemption, and how was it able to pass? Was this done legally?
So the exemption power in the Ontario Environmental Assessment Act is unfortunately quite expansive. And so they were able to pass a regulation under that power exempting the Bradford Bypass, as they have with many other major projects, such as major transit projects in the GTA. And, you know, increasingly a host of other types of projects are being dealt with under what are essentially exemptions, because there is no key decision about whether or not the project goes ahead under those processes. So yeah, they can do it under their regulatory power in the Act, you know, subject to it meeting the purposes of the Act. Now, you know, unfortunately, our current Environmental Assessment Act, it speaks about the betterment of people of Ontario. That's a very broad purpose compared to some other environmental assessment legislation that exists in other jurisdictions that looks more narrowly at, you know, is this sustainable? Is this good for the environment, in a more fixed way? So unfortunately, for the time being, we're stuck with that exemption, at least to the extent that, you know, it was something that was done under a power in the Environmental Assessment Act.
Gord, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure,
Yes.
I mean, Laura's right. I mean, it's legal is the issue. They have the power, they have the discretion to do that. But it's interesting that they don't in the past always. Look at the example of something else people are from your area are familiar with is minister zoning orders. You know, we've always had minister zoning orders, but they were used very sparingly, only in situations where things were had locked up or there was a lot of stake and there were no resolution involved. So it was like used with great discretion and in important situations. Well, why was it? Because there were other people and factors that said, no, you may have the power to order things like, but let's look at this in the fullness. And we had institutions like the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, like what I was for 15 years, right? Who didn't have the power to stop things or anything, but could call them out and say, whoa, you've made a decision that has gone beyond the accepted behavior of a provincial government. You may have the legal right to do this, but it is not acceptable to the general public who believe they should be participating in government decision-making about the environment, especially when they're laying out $10 billion and it's their natural environment and their endangered species that were lost and their Lake Simcoe that is at risk here. So they have been at this a while. You know, for people who don't know, there is no environmental commissioner like I was for 15 years. That power, that discretion, that institution has been destroyed so that they can use absolute power corruptly, if in the view of people like us who have spent our lives building a public policy system that was responsive to the wishes of the people.
You must have done a really good job, Gord, because that was the first thing they did, right? Is let's axe the power of the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's office and
Got rid of that Miller guy pretty fast. He retired and then they axed the office.
I know. Well, he couldn't be followed. I'm really sorry for all the screaming behind me. Okay, there's another question from Ann Seymour, and the question is, and I'm going to ask you to answer this, Gord, because you just had a shorter speaking time. Who actually does the studies? A company, Ministry of the Environment, government, or corporate?
Generally, the studies, there's some studies that are done by government, but the vast majority of them are done by consultants who respond to the proponent. The proponent in this particular case we're talking about, it would be the Ministry of Transportation. So and they would hire consultants to cover off the various aspects of the environmental work. Sometimes the government does, particular parts of the government will do things if they're particularly concerned about something. But generally speaking, it's done through consult, but it's reviewed by Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Natural Resources staff.
Except under the exemption.
Well, not now, because there's an exemption, right? So there's no studies.
But even the studies they are doing don't get approved or authorized in any way by MOE under the exemption.
Yeah, if I could, there's a couple points that I'd like to make. And the first goes back to one of the things I said earlier, and that is in order to have just recovery, you need wise investments. And while the Ministry of Transportation hasn't at all come clean in terms of how much this is going to cost, you know, what we do here is it's around the $2 billion mark. And, you know, so my question, or not even question, but it's a comment about what else we could be doing with $2 billion that would be to the betterment of our communities. And I'm thinking of our nurses and health professionals that the Conservative government has waged war on. I'm thinking of people in long-term care facilities. We have 4 times as many people per room than other provinces, which is why, big reason why the pandemic, complete shortage of long-term care. And that doesn't even get into housing or other critical issues like hunger. We're seeing a lot of increase in hunger, and just curious as to what your thoughts might be on that as well, where we look at this, and I think you alluded to it around the environmental assessment, like what's the need, and in particular, what's the need relative to other needs, I guess.
You want the answer?
Sure, go, Gord.
Well, absolutely, Gary. I mean, this is a huge expenditure of our money, provincial money, tax money, but and we have lots of other things that could be spent on. But why are we spending the money if the benefit is going to be, the financial benefit of this is going to be housing developments, that these houses are going to sell $900,000 to $1 million a pop? Why aren't we levying those lots and those developments if they are the benefactors of our $2 billion or more, is it whatever the figure is, that we tax? Why should the taxpayers lay out huge amounts of money that which could be better spent, is your point, in order to allow private sector developers to make huge amounts of money? Why not just levy those lots? And the whole process of having to say, okay, land developers, you can get your housing developments, but you're going to have to pay. You're going to pay a large amount of money per lot, $50,000 a lot. Let's throw that out there. Boy, all of a sudden, that maybe rethinking how we do housing settlements, rethinking how we do highways, the whole dynamic would change, right? But oh no, if it's just about taxpayers build the highway and land developers keep all the money, I think that's a different kind of environmental assessment process.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what's you know, furthermore outrageous is where you see the highway sort of make these turns out of nowhere to sort of avoid people's properties and things like that. I mean, it just makes the blood boil. And I guess one other point I do want to clarify is that as a group, we're not anti-development per se. In fact, I was involved with this group called Smart Growth Barrie. So it seemed like 20 years ago. Not that you'd know it by looking at Barrie now, but I think the idea is let's have growth, but let's do it in a smart way with urban growth boundaries, with higher density growth, with public transit, and that ultimately it's a win-win situation because as you've indicated before, it's property owners who end up carrying the brunt for this development.
I want to get to some other questions that have been asked. So here's a juicy one from James Leduc. What about keeping farmers in Bradford, West Gwillimbury and the surrounding area? If farmers can't get their product to market, then they could leave to another area. The bypass is crossing non-farming lands using up 0.35% of the marsh, 10.75 hectares of 3,000 hectares of marshland. That's maybe why you don't have farmers opposing this bypass. The environmental assessment is being done. Just go to the website, bradfordbypass.ca. Laura, do you want to start on that? I know you've been looking at this issue for a long time as a former resident of the area. So let's start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, the first point I'd like to make about farmers getting their produce to market, and they're only 10 minutes away from the 404 highway if they need an alternative north-south route. The Bradford Bypass does not take produce to market. It connects the 404 to the 400 highway. And you know, the food terminal is in Mississauga. It's not along the Bradford Bypass. And you know, in terms of those statistics that are quoted in the question, they're inaccurate in the sense that it does cross the Holland Marsh specialty crop area. It would remove and destroy a segment of that area directly. It would also potentially, because the groundwater impacts have never been studied, contaminate the groundwater in the Holland Marsh with chloride, which, you know, is a very serious issue. So, you know, yes.
Road salt. Tell people it's roadside. They won't get the chloride, Laura.
Yeah, with road salt. So we're talking about something that it literally has the potential to salt the earth. And we don't know how extensive the shallow groundwater contamination will be because we've never seen those studies. And there is no EA being conducted. As I said, you can go to that website, bradfordbypass.ca. There are studies being completed after construction commences to resolve those issues. So the construction will already be there. The potential shallow groundwater contamination will already possibly be occurring or locked in through the existing construction and the existing route. And we don't know if that can be mitigated. That was one of the things that was noted as outstanding in 2002. I would suggest that if they had an easy mitigation solution to that chloride problem, they would have done something to identify what it was in the last 20 years that they've had to do that. So I think, you know, I think it's naive to think that just because it doesn't go through the polder marsh, that there aren't going to be potentially serious agricultural impacts. And the case is just not made that the Bradford Bypass actually takes produce to market. The food terminal is at the end of the 400 highway corridor route at Mississauga. It is not in Queensville. So, you know, I've heard the Holland Marsh Growers Association make that argument. I'd love to see some evidence that they're actually unable to get their produce to market. I've never seen any. And we also know that the traffic congestion on the 400 actually worsens under a Bradford Bypass scenario, as it does on the 404 highway. So this highway is not going to help anyone get their produce to market. If anything, it's going to increase congestion on the two north-south corridors that both commuters and farmers need to use.
I just wanted to share here, I shared this map that is with the, can everyone see it? The soils inventory for the province overlaid. You can see that's not a zoning thing, that's just the quality of the soils according to what the province said. And I think I'd also submit that the National Farmers Union just did a survey of farmers that it has in the area that would be impacted by the bypass, and over 70% of them said that they felt that the bypass would have a negative impact on their farm operation. So I think it's also unfair to say it's all farmers, it's some farmers, definitely not all of them. And as you can see, it goes through a lot of goes through a lot of class 1 and class 2 soil outside of just what the organics are. Do you want me to take that down now, or? Yeah. All right.
Okay. I'm going to keep on directing questions if that's okay, because there's so many good ones. This one's directed to Gord from June Kingston. How much communication occurs between different ministries before decisions are made? And why are we not talking enough about the health effects of highways and commuter communities?
Interesting. Of course, let's be clear, in this particular case, the province is exempted, so there are no talks about behind ministries and no studies. But in the general case, what you're saying, if it was a sort of normal situation, there is a fair amount of communication. But interestingly enough, that when all the years, like before I was commissioner, I worked for the Ministry of the Environment for a number of years. So I've got like 40 years of experience in this field. And Interesting enough, the health stuff isn't a major consideration. The health ministry, they do talk about air pollution and health factors, and that's usually done at a provincial level, but you don't see them intruding as a Ministry of Health too much in things like environmental assessments for highways. Like, so they usually go after provincial high level initiatives. But in terms of a particular EA, if one was done, you would certainly see direct input from the scientists and technical people in the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Ministry of Transportation, and perhaps other ministries, working day to day with the details of the project. Interesting enough, it is interesting. It's a good question why the Ministry of Health doesn't, but I didn't used to see it. When the health would always occur, there was lots of health discussion and lobbying, but it was at the provincial level of concern. I hope that answers it.
Well, it satisfies me, so that's helpful. Thank you. All right, the next question I'm going to direct to Margaret, if that's okay. What is the official stance of other parties on the bypass? Did I just read that Del Duca would go ahead with the bypass? The answer has changed over time. Margaret, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, that's fine. The Greens and NDP have said unequivocally that they will cancel the highway if they are in a position of power. The Liberals started off saying that, a lot of municipalities want it and therefore it might be a vital piece of infrastructure. 7 municipalities that are now requesting in-depth studies. A lot of public pressure has changed the tune. Now they have said that they believe it requires a full and comprehensive new environmental assessment, and they will not put shovels in the ground until that is done. And if the bypass does not pass the muster, which I can't believe that it will, if you can, they also mentioned that they would factor in induced demand and climate change. And I think those two things alone would probably kill this project. But they said if it doesn't meet the smell test, if you will, of the threshold of the environmental assessment that they have, that they would also cancel it. So that is the official positions of all of the three parties. And of course, the Conservative Party wants to build it as soon as possible.
Yeah, if I may jump in just because it's really related to this, and I noticed the one question here. The question is, would it be influential to do a phone zap to the local MPs and mayors in Bradford, East Gwillimbury, York region, and where do they stand on this issue for or against the Bradford bypass?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah, if you could, I think you'd probably be the best, although Claire might as well.
Oh, it might be Claire. Do you want to handle it, Claire?
Sure. So we did a lot of work with members of the community, getting resolutions from councils. And so we have lots of councils in the Lake Simcoe watershed that have asked for federal impact assessments. I'll try to list them. Scugog, Barrie, Romera, Georgina almost did, but not quite. Anyway, sorry. Oh, Adjtos, at Halitos, Toronto. There's a few more. Okay, so there's 7 that said, yes, we want a federal impact assessment. There's a couple more that said we want more studies. They might not have thought to say, we want the studies to be done before the building starts, and we want the studies to inform the building. So they will not, or their desires will not be met. We do have now a federal MP in Aurora, Newmarket, Leah Taylor-Roy, who has really been a big help. She's fairly recently elected, and she's the one who put the parliamentary petition together for us with Margaret. And so she's been super helpful. The other MPs have been basically quite quiet. We had numbers of us had some all candidates meetings in the federal election, and it was one of our questions. I did York Simcoe, and the Liberals are sort of on the fence. The NDP said they would stop it, and the Conservative did not show up. the debate to talk about the Bradford Bypass. Margaret may have something more to add to that, but I think it's a good idea. I really appreciate you putting the idea in there. This has been really successful, so that might be something we would consider.
And I would just say that Claire had sent out a letter to the MPPs of the area and the MPs saying, like, you keep talking about Lake Simcoe is really important. Where are you on this? Because the Conservation Authority has said they are not going to weigh in on this unless the province asks them to. And, you know, and this might be something that Gord can speak to as well, about the role of conservation authorities and actually being stewards for the watersheds they're supposed to protect. And now they're saying, we're not going to get involved unless the province wants us to get involved. And then it's going to be a voluntary review. And even then, we don't know how cutting we can be. So where are the heroes of Lake Simcoe beyond campaign clickbait, right?
Is that a question or is that just a comment?
It could be either. What would you prefer?
Well, conservation authorities, of course, ultimately are children, although they're created by the province, the Conservation Authorities Act. The province has very little to do with how they operate and anymore since they stopped funding them. So they're really creatures of the municipality in the watershed. So it goes back to what Claire was talking about. That's the direct action into the conservation authorities. But can I, if I don't want to change the topic radically, but just in terms of who you're contacting, Margaret, and who and sort of who you're trying to create an issue with. Here's somebody that you may or not have thought of. This is not a decision maker per se, but Jerry DeMarco, who I suspect Claire knows, and I known for many years, and Laura, he ran Ecojustice for a number of years. He is the federal commissioner for the environment and sustainable development. He has a role as a watchdog or oversee of government decision-making when it comes to the environment. And although he can't sway this decision, he can certainly, if he was, CC'd on all the concerns and alerted to the situation, he represents someone who can, after the fact, report on what the government ultimately does or doesn't do. But in the short term, it's always good that the government, when they're caught in the throes of a decision, to know that the watchdog knows what they're doing too, right? The watchdog acts after the fact in this case, but it's always good that the watchdog is informed and the people who are making the decision say, one day Jerry DeMarco is going to write a report and mention in his report and talk about what we did here. Maybe we better make sure that we do it right.
Appreciate that point. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge to engage MPs in the area, and so I'll just offer a bit of a reflection there. I think where there are a lot of drivers and commuters, I think the politicians get it in their head that, oh, these people must just be like, don't offend me in my car. Just, you can't offend me in my car. Maybe some people feel that way, but I think most of us are much more nuanced than that. And I think we can say, yeah, I have to drive to work, but I also really care about the environment and the future and frogs and fishing or whatever. But that's most Ontarians, I would say. And so I think there's a bit of a misstep, thinking that, you can just campaign on build highways and that all other considerations are irrelevant. And I think that actually that whole kind of thinking has got maybe to the MPs. So I think if there's anyone else, you want to call on this, calling your member of parliament would be really helpful and sort of explain how you feel about this stuff. It's been hard to get. So I am not seeing a whole lot of other questions here.
I think there was some more further up in the chat. Joel had one for Gord specifically about what he thought about the anti-environment agenda that's happening between the highways or stripping power of conservation authorities, the Endangered Species Act changes, or even the approval of culling the double-crested cormorant with zero science to support it. In your experience, have you ever seen anything like this in previous governments?
The short answer is the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is, of course, no. This has never occurred in Ontario since we started worrying about the environment in 1970, 72, and we formed the Environmental Protection Act. But what characterizes correctly, what you're seeing is not a government that is particularly, particularly attacking environmental things so much. It is a government that chooses to exclude the people from consideration of environmentally significant decisions of government, and that's a qualitative difference. I mean, you easily could probably point to something they did right that you like, but they're not posting things in the environmental registry. They eliminated the environment so that people don't know what's happening. They're exempting and bypassing all kinds of reviews and canceling environmental assessments and eliminating the environmental commissioner's office. All these things all relate to not allowing the public to participate, to be notified and involved in decision-making about significant environmental issues that the government is making. And this is a profoundly important concept that we had down. We were doing well for many years in Ontario. And that's what this government's doing. It's cutting us out, and that's significant. That's not, and more, to me, that's more important, more critical than any particular decision that is made or cut out of. The fact that they do not want to allow us to want to participate, and are, in that sense, they are contemptuous of the Ontario people, and that's wrong.
Yeah, well, I think on that point, because I think that, captures a lot of the sentiment for today, and what it is that we're trying to accomplish, both in this very concrete sense of trying to stop the Bradford Bypass, but seeing it as much of a larger pattern that is very troublesome, that we are seeing right across the province. And so I see the fight for the Bradford Bypass as part and parcel of this broader struggle. And I think we all need to see it that way, and not necessarily else just get focused on what's going on in our own backyard. But what I would like to do is to thank our panelists and our speakers for your time and your obvious commitment, your expertise, and your generosity. And I would also like to thank all of our many participants who joined us this evening. And what no doubt is a busy time. We really, really appreciate it. And I was noting some of the comments from Margaret to some of the participants, as for people involved in leading these things, it's so important to see that grassroots support and action. And as I said before, and I'm going to say it again, I really believe that we can potentially turn the tide with this one. I think we're at a critical stage, but I think if enough of us speak out, and that's us calling, getting everyone we know to make those calls, also taking up some of the advice of Gord, calling others, but if we direct enough attention to this, I think we might, sway this particular issue in our favor. And so on that hopeful note, I would like to wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.